It's just preparing to live stream now. Okay, so we are live streaming on YouTube. Hey, everybody who is a part of ONYX Pages. We are having a discussion hosted by Kiki about Tender Stories by Sofia Samatar. I'm going to pass it on to Kiki, but everybody welcome. And if you've had an opportunity to read the book, feel free to connect in the chat. And yeah, I'll step back.
Okay, so I wanted to pick up on both of your points because I agree with both of you completely. So I think I'll take Claire's on first. I think she's definitely pulling on Sufism tradition in Islam, which does bring in the mysticism aspect that you picked up on. I am not an expert. I just recognize, so like I'm not coming for that position, but I just recognize some elements from it, especially because I subscribe to Arabic Quarterly, which is this quarterly literary magazine, obviously. And they will have writings on Sufism and traditions and stuff. And so you can, I think there's I wouldn't say necessarily anything specific that I could identify, but there just feels like there's a similar feeling. And then she writes about dreams a lot. I think for her, it's so much of like the interior and the intangible, as opposed to kind of the more concrete world building and plots that conflict is centered around. I feel like so much of her stories really have sort of like minimal external world building, and then the main conflict is more of morals and ethics and religion, because she is Mennonite. And so I find that element to come into her work as well. Did either of you read Fallow? Because it was pretty long, so maybe not.
That was the one I skipped in part because I knew I wouldn't be able to finish it.
Yeah, because it's a long one, but it's like her Anabaptist, just to give you the plot details, it's like her Anabaptist in space story. And you really see, I'll try and, as I talk, think about other stories that could maybe link to it, but there is this thread also of non-violence, of not wanting to be in physical conflict of the world, and then wanting to leave it, of escape, of isolation. I also found like a lot of characters were like that as well. There are two stories in the second section. A request for extension of the clarity.
I read that one.
Yeah, and I think Tender and the title story like are both about characters in isolation, and sort of trying to figure out how they want to be in the world. And I just find that to be like a major thing in her stories. As for the race of her characters, to me anyway, she is rarely explicit. So most of the time it's more like a nationality. So like Mona in Selkifer stories is of Egyptian heritage. Her mom was from, so like I picked up on that. Or things like in Fallow, where the characters will release her hair and the hair springs up. Like she says, the hair stands up, like she unbraids. And it's like little clues like, oh, hey. It's little clues like that, or someone will have brown skin, that kind of thing in passing, but she absolutely doesn't foreground it. And I don't think all of the stories are about Black people as well. I mean, some like Olympia's Ghosts, I feel, because it's Sigmund Freud and they're actually like real world characters. But what was interesting for me is that I read the Sandman story by E.T.A. Hoffman because I wanted to be like, okay, what's this about? And it's interesting because one of the characters in there is described in very, to me, racist, potentially anti-Semitic characteristics. And so it made me think, even perhaps, even when the characters themselves aren't Black, what she's responding to in the way she writes the work is influenced by how they wrote about particular characters. But I don't know if it's, I noticed the racial ambiguity, but I think coming from a country in our literature where most of us are Black, and so writers aren't necessarily foregrounding those details, it didn't really, it wasn't a major thing for me. And I also found that kind of interesting because, again, she is diaspora, you know, she's just like one gen removed. But in a lot of ways, I don't feel as if her writing really, well, fits in with anybody, but also, so like really, I don't know who I would put her with. But also to me, it really, it stands out. And what it reminded me of was, I've read Son of the Storm by C. Davis Okunbowa, who's Nigerian. He's living in Canada now, though, I think. And in some of the reviews I saw on Bookstagram for the book, they complained about the language. They complained about the language in two of his books, actually, the debut and in Son of the Storm. And I found that, I'm not really going to get into any details there, but I found it really odd because for me, at least in Son of the Storm, I loved the way how language worked in it, because to me, it seemed very obviously Nigerian in the sense of multiplicity of languages in all different kinds of groups and different registers within those languages. And it just seemed very much of the space. So I think for me, I'm always actually kind of looking out for writing by Black writers where Blackness looks differently, I guess, or who maybe aren't always, even though I think she is, foregrounding it in the way we're familiar with. Because so many of our stories deal with immigration and colonialism and all of that stuff. And I mean, and that's race, but it's just not, I think maybe those, if either of you read that, is maybe the most obvious in terms of the racial aspect. And it is one of my favorites. But I'm really intrigued by writers who configure it differently in ways that I don't expect, and in ways where, I don't know, I think may not immediately read to me as Black, but then why isn't it Black? You know, like if why isn't it Black, I guess, was the question for me sometimes when I was reading it. What kind of plots do I expect, or what kind of stories do I expect, or what do I expect characters to be doing, that here I am reading this book of this story about, I don't know, radium and radiation and history, and I would feel like, oh, well, this isn't, like, why wouldn't it be? You know, like, yeah, this collection made me had those questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt that I found myself asking the question, well, how do I know that this character is not Black? Is it important for there to be a Black protagonist in order for some story to be characterized as Black speculative fiction? What are themes that are associated with Blackness? And then it got me thinking about the dialogue between African futurism and Afrofuturism, and some of the stories are futurist. And it definitely challenged me in those ways. And I think for me, in reading this particular book, I realized that I have a positive bias towards books that have stories that include some kind of like self-emancipation, or some kind of like a character sort of going through their own understanding of how a world is structured, and or a story that is critical of a particular structure or proposes an alternative structure. I'm really attracted to those stories that are about the mundanity of life. They hit different. I like them as well. But in this collection, I found myself asking, what is this story supposed to be doing? Right? What is its purpose? And am I moved by that? And so in some cases, with some of the stories, I felt like this feels good. Like the one, so it will be helpful for me to just refer to certain stories.
Yeah, that's good.
So for example, like the first one, I love that this story was the first story in the first section. Selkie stories are for losers, because I had this moment on page 5 where I realized that my intonation, the way that I speak, like my accent and the words that I emphasize actually can change the meaning of the entire like story for me. So when I first read the story, and I first read the title, I thought Selkie stories are for losers, right? And then when I got to the main character's sense of loss and losing her mother, and that Selkie stories, the ones that were sort of woven into the story here, that many of these stories are about like fear of losing a person, the attempt to entrap someone out of desperation and fear of loneliness, and then also the violence and the harm that can come from that, and the fear that those of us afraid of loss will, you know, infect sometimes our relationships with, right? And then when I started reading that, I was like, oh, Selkie stories are for losers, right? And it was more like when you are somebody who is losing someone or afraid of losing someone, Selkie stories are for you.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's a totally different title, right? And I was like, that's brilliant, right? That's brilliant. This and it was almost like she was playing with these two different statements, because the main character, I forget her actual name. All I remember is Mona. But
I don't know if we get her name. I wonder. Yeah.
The main character sees herself in a lot of ways as a loser, and is very self-deprecating. And so, you know, the Selkie stories are for her. They have a healing potential to them. And so I really, like, after I read that first one, I was like, okay, let's get it, right? Let's do this collection, because this collection is going to be about the things that we believe about ourselves, or that we're told to believe about ourselves, that we're told to believe about our people. And that those beliefs are going to get turned on their head. And then we get to Ogres of East Africa. I'm not going to go through all of them that I read, but I'll stop it at this. But then we get to Ogres of East Africa, and I was like, is the protagonist an ogre? Is he going to find out that he's an ogre? Oh my God, he's an ogre. Is he an ogre though? And then what's this? What, you know, what's going on then? Who's the ogre? What's an ogre? Well, didn't they think we were all ogres? Like, and this whole like listing and writing in the margins, and then the thread, like just following the story of the red thread, and then just being like, oh my God, there is a red thread that runs through all of our histories. And I was just like, right. And then I was just like, oh shit, this is wow, right? And I found that there was like her caricatures of the employer. And and as an employment lawyer, many of the stories, because there's a lot of stories about like working for somebody, being like a servant or being an employer or being enslaved. And so like it really, those were good for me in a lot of different ways. But when I read that one as well, I thought, oh shit, right? Like Sofia is asking us to examine in this story colonialism and nomenclature and academia and anthropology. That's what it felt like to me, to examine that through a very like intimate relationship between three people and then a little bit more, right? You know, and I really loved that. When I heard you on the chat talk about these stories as feminist, I thought that my view of a feminist speculative fiction story was very limited. And so hearing you identify these stories as feminist, I went back to think about them. And I looked specifically at the operation of patriarchy and the female characters, the women characters. And I just thought, of course, this is feminist. And I just enjoyed that, at least in these two stories and several others, I was left questioning, right? Most of the stories left me in a bit of a pleasant tailspin. Some of them, I just need more time with them because I just couldn't enter into them, and I don't like that feeling. But I had that for about 4 of the stories. But I'll pause here because I'd love to get into like the themes of the specific ones, because I have so many questions.
Yeah.
Like so many questions. Many of them are very delicious stories.
Yeah. Claire, did you have anything to add before I pick up on that?
So there's one thing is that I'm gonna need to turn off my camera. I'm moving locations.
Sure.
So I'll be kind of like present, but also moving around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, not specifically to what Jerry was saying, though everything that you said, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, like that first story was so whimsical, not whimsical, but so kind of like circular, and that made me think about when you were talking about Sufism. And I don't know anything about Sufism, although the one thing I know is like the circle dance. And how when you said that, I was like, oh, it's because the stories feel very circular. Like there was a story about the girl who's writing an essay to her teacher whose nephew
Walk dog.
Walk dog.
Yeah.
Oh.
And yeah, and so you're like, and the way that she needed to go through using walk dog, but also these circles of different aspects of their interactions with each other, so that she could get to a place where she said, and I was his girlfriend, you know, and he was actually so, and I couldn't even invite him to my house, and I couldn't even like walk home with him. And yeah, that introspection of like guilt and who am I? How do I navigate this world where like I want to feel safe, and so I'm being complicit with these structures of oppression, but at the same time I also recognize that I'm, you know, in this case like in love with this boy, and maybe not love is maybe too strong for this kind of like very young type of relationship that they have. Yeah, I'm just really interested by that. And I was thinking about what Jerry was saying in terms of being mixed race and being half Mennonite, the sense of like not for myself and my identity. I find myself struggling to get to a place where I'm like, I know my identity, and it feels like I'm getting more comfortable with the idea that like maybe I'm never going to really feel comfortable with that. And I think about what my mother always told me growing up, which is you're Canadian, enrichi du sang haïtien et du sang mennonite. So I'm Canadian, but I'm enriched with Haitian and Mennonite blood. And the idea of like Blackness being part of our story, but who we are is those cultural identities. So the Haitian identity and the Mennonite identity. And Mennonite isn't very much like, it's not a nation-based, it's like it's a religious-based identity. But very much having these conversations with my mother about how it's not so your identity, like the Blackness is part of the political identity that you are required to be part of, but who you are is the history of your ancestors, which is a different reality, and how that comes through in these stories as well. I don't think I had realized that until this conversation, but just things I've been thinking about as we're talking.
Yeah, yeah. She has mentioned in interviews about, you know, her two ancestries, and how so much of her work is against sort of duality, or maybe not against duality is the word, but it's about sort of trying to break borders, or at least make borders porous, because otherwise, as a way to understand herself, right? Because so many others would place these things in opposition, and then what would that make her? But here she is, like she's, especially since she's existed in a lot of I think predominantly white Mennonite spaces. And you think of the history of Christian religion, especially in relation to Black people and colonialism and all of that stuff. And she'll be in these spaces and people will like ask her, you know, what are you? And she'll go, and she mentioned how in one conversation, the man just went, no, when she said who she was. Like, he didn't know, you know, just direct rejection of like her existence being possible. Just like, you know, and then there's another, I'm trying to remember, I think it is an actual, in one of the stories where they get very autobiographical, where she mentions asking the name of who I believe is a Somali student, or I don't know if it's a student, but it's a Somali colleague, maybe, whatever, and they give the name, but it's a fake name, like it's not a proper noun. Like clearly the person was mocking her, apparently, like maybe thinking she wouldn't know this word, you know, because she is US and she's in this Mennonite space. And in this story, I'll try and find which story it is later so I can say, the character sort of just excuses himself and just goes to the bathroom because like she can't, you know, gosh. But going back to like talking about specific themes. So getting back to Selkie stories are for losers. So and I'll maybe just talk more about the feminism, how I think it weaves throughout her stories. So we lost Claire. We come back.
Well, Claire
Oh right, she's moving the camera
around.
Yeah, I forgot. I just remembered.
There's here.
Right. So most of the stories, if not all of them, have women narrators. I think there are a couple that aren't women, but even when they aren't, the femme character that they're engaging with, I think, is kind of giving them the finger in one way or the other. By that I mean this. And Selkies are for losers. So some of the things I noticed, first of all, was Mona's situation and her mother, and the mothers and the daughters in that story, because Selkie stories are typically about men capturing these coats of these creatures, which is basically then this coercion of the women into their lives, and then them eventually finding their own freedom and just leaving. And I found that really interesting in relation to the two daughters that we see. So you have the narrator, and it made me think about her mother and what were the implications and of thinking about Selkie stories in relation to her. Like, did this imply some kind of coercion? Like, I felt that there was a kind of power dynamic that's there that even if the narrator wasn't aware of, had me thinking as a reader, like, did her mother even want to be there or want to be a mother? You know, and then the opportunity that she has to go, she just dips. And then with Mona, a mother who seems to, I mean, she was suicidal. She tried to commit several times and clearly seems to be longing for home, because Mona is constantly worried that her mom's going to take her and just zips with her back to Egypt. And it made me wonder about what were the forces in Mona's mother's life that made her leave. And that kind of loss. And then if she kind of just took Mona with her back to Egypt, what kind of cycle of displacement that would be perpetuating in a way, even though, because for the mother, it would be for her returning home, and for Mona, it would be a completely strange place that she'd be going against her will. You know, like she has no, and I was thinking of the kind of the different sort of patriarchal and also colonialist and imperialist forces that kind of brought all these characters together here at this diner. And then the first thing I think Mona says to her when she starts talking to her is, stay away from my uncle, he's a creep. So like, that was the first, and so that was the second thing. I was like, what does Mona know that had her be so sure, and it had that be like the first thing she says, do not be alone with him. And then the narrator actually being in a situation where she's getting out of the car and the uncle says, close the door. And she's like, haha, only on the other side. And they laugh about it. But like, for me, it was, so I find it to be in these subtle and not so subtle ways. Samatar sort of delineating these patriarchal dynamics with characters that are usually pretty, they're not just victims, they're not just passive. But you can definitely see the harm done in some cases, and in other cases, imagine it. She may not detail it, but I think depending on your reader's experience, and if you're femme in any way, you're going to be able to relate for sure. That was what I noted, because even in Jerry, when he talked about the employment thing, there's a story, I don't know if you guys read it, Account of the Land of Witches. And that's like this, and basically enslavement and also sexual violence, and like all in this really beautifully written story. Like when I tell you, the language in it is gorgeous, but the content is kind of horrific. And it reminded me so much, despite it's really like Silky's Stories is very contemporary, and Account for the Land of the Witches is sort of very high fantasy, weird, kind of abstract, quite frankly, dreamscape kind of a read. But like at the core of it, to me, it just felt so familiar to sexual abuse survivor stories, where you have your version and you put it out there, and then the employer comes and says, that's bullshit. And everything that she says is bullshit, and just and completely dismisses, undermines, gaslights, and tears down like the reality of who they've abused, like on every level. And then also exploiting and also wanting to make money off of it. Like just in total and complete. But in this, you know, and then also authorship of story. Oh gosh, there's so much, but I don't want to get too distracted. Yeah, I just want to share, like, that was sort of the way how I was like detailing what I saw as feminist, because I felt even in Ogres of East Africa, is her name Mary, I think? The one that, yes, the colleague. I love her. I find that there are also so many characters here that when men come and want to know more about them, and they just say, no, it's actually none of your business. Like it comes up again in that weird story, The Tale of Whatever, that I'm not even going to pretend to really know what's going on there. Tale of, I mean, clearly she's referencing
Mahila and Mahu and the White-footed Gazelle.
Yes, like clearly referencing particular stories in that book that she references, like she lays out the path for it, but I didn't go look it up. I was like, next time. Next time. But like How I Met the Ghoul is a shorter one that also references like a specific real writer and a real story in which that writer depicted this encounter with a ghoul, and the details or the lack of details also seem to imply some kind of sexual violence. But the journalist is coming to the ghoul and she goes, "Is that what you're going to ask me? So I'm going to tell you." He's like, no, I was never going to bring that up. I thought that was
him. Yeah. I wanted to know exactly what that meant.
exactly.
Like something about being underneath the ghoul or
right.
contact with the ghoul.
Yeah. And she's like, "Oh, is that, you want to know about the details of that?" And he's like, "Oh no, that's definitely not what I wanted to know about." And she just puts the barrier right there. So unless he's gonna crumble his pride and try to get it anyway, he kind of just has to back off and go a different route. Like, she takes control of that situation. And so I really liked how a lot of the stories could feel really sort of out there. But then when I thought about it more, it also felt like really super directly connected to the real world.
Yeah.
So that was Silky Stories Are for Losers for me. Like, there is so much in that one little story.
I wrote down there's one story where I'm like, please ask Kiki to tell me what the hell is going on. Let me find which one that was.
I know.
Because I was just, sometimes I like it when the story bests me and I'm like, but if I feel like
let's see.
after reading something, I'm just like, oh. Yeah, go ahead, Claire.
I didn't have anything to add. I just got in a place where I could turn my video back on.
Okay.
There's some, like, so many beautiful sentences too. Like, this is from Cities of Emerald, Deserts of Gold, which
That's one of my favorites.
I loved that one, Claire. It's 6 pages. I loved it. And I really want to know what you think of it, Claire. I think you would really like it too. But there's a line that says, Dorothy, as in the Wizard of Oz. So Dorothy's lesson, "There's no place like home," was intended to reconcile her to the monochromatic endlessness of Kansas. This is a lesson neither of my parents learned. And I was like, and also how she talks about like the endless goldenness of the place, and talking about gold and the endless blondness of a place, and going back from gold to blonde, and gold to blonde to bland to gold to blonde to bland. And I was like, this is really great. Yeah, it just really masterfully written. So the ones that I just didn't understand and had a hard time getting into include A Brief History of Non-Duality Studies. I struggled with that one. One of my favorite stories is How to Get Back to the Forest. Was one of my favorite stories. Claire, did you read that one? Yeah. Okay. So How to Get Back to the that's an amazing one. I'm just noting which ones we've all read because I do want to talk about them. So when we do all read them, like I just like your thoughts. I'm not saying I don't want to spoil you. I'm saying like I want your I want your eyes on this one because I think that I just want to know what you think about it. Yeah.
I feel like I need to read all of her work, like a Black Mennonite author who's talking about that experience for me just feels like so intense. And I feel like, anyways.
And she comes for them. And she is not like, especially like if you read Fallow, it's like, it's interesting. Like she comes for them, but then also she's a part of them. And so what I find like with that one that you mentioned, How to Get Back to the Forest, like the narrator in that one, typically, I think especially, I don't know, is it especially, or it may just be what I read. I think when it comes to Black SFF, or maybe just dystopian settings in general. I do find that they are, like in Jerry said, in terms of what you have a positive bias towards, and they're like putting out alternative worlds, like kind of constructing like an alternative way of being that is not what we have now, and like giving a blueprint for maybe what that could look like. But I find instead with Samatar, where I find her characters actually more or less reckoning with the world as is and trying to find a way to live in it. They're not necessarily the big rebels. So like with How to Get Back to the Forest, the narrator isn't the rebellious character. She is looking at the rebellious character, who is the one who's trying to like encourage and push the rest of them to be like, they're fucking with us, da 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 da. It's the same thing with Fallow, where it's like a relationship with the narrator and her older sister. And the older sister is the one who cannot stay in that society. Like she gets closer, and maybe that's why too. I won't give all the details, but she gets closer to like the brutality of what those empowered do in that society to maintain what they're doing. And that and other factors that I won't say, I think make it so that she's like, I cannot stay. And she kind of looks at her younger sister.
Feel free to I don't mind spoilers. I think this is the type of text where spoilers won't spoil it.
Yeah. True. So with Fallow, the narrator's older sister, the father physically abuses her. And it's quite, again, it's subtly done. I think there's maybe one line where the older sister says it plain. So I guess if you didn't pick it up before that, you get it then. It's like, how can you be a pacifist, but you regularly you beat your kid with a hose? How does that work? Right? But otherwise, it's just things like, this is the room that our father took her to, and like maybe it would be like, and she would fall and hit her head on this, and she hit her head on that, and that's kind of like the only deep. But because you see it in succession, you go, wait a minute, that why you dropping so often, like clearly something, and that's kind of how you pick it up. But she basically decides like, I need to go, I need to escape, I cannot stay here. And she looks at her younger sister as the innocent one, because I think that's how the sister thinks. That's the only way you could stay. Like, clearly, it's either you're innocent or you know what's going on like me and have to go. But because you see most of the story from the younger sister's perspective, you realize that she knows. In fact, she is, in her way, an archivist of her own experience and of others, and of things that society wants to forget, that they want to put in the dust yard. That's what they call it. And her writing for her is like gathering the things from the dust yard and making a record of it. But she decides to stay. And to her, she puts it as, there is a fourth path to endure. And the first time I read this story, it's probably still my favorite, and I just loved it unabashedly. But the second time I read it, I had a lot more complex feelings towards the narrator, because I think I was kind of like or I wanted to imagine, like I wanted to associate myself with the older sister who's like, no, it's either this or that, like we gotta go. But in fact, I think most of us are more like the narrator. Like we're more like the narrator in How to Get Back to a Forest. Like we're trying to figure out how to be, but we're not necessarily that more figure, reluctant or not, put into that situation or not, that I see in other sort of SFF who are like, okay, and we're gonna go out and change things. Or the way they change things in this story, for example, I think in the last one, Red Thread, because they're often pacifist, because that also is a common thread throughout a lot of the stories, then what does rebellion look like? Because you're not going to take up arms. You're not, and the violence system has been violently imposed. So often the only option when you want to break the table, then you're going to have to break it with some kind of opposing violent force. But these are people who have said, we're not doing violence. So then what do?
You
and
and your
right. So I guess for me, like reading a lot of them the second time around, I felt more implicated by a lot of the narrators in a way where, because I was like, if you're feeling uncomfortable with her decision, then what about you? Because you basically doing the same thing. Like you ain't out there on some big mission trying to blah, blah, blah. Like you're more or less like, you're chilling with your family, you're chilling with your friends, you're writing. Like you're trying to do your thing, but it's not like a big radical blueprint of the new world. And that really hit me on the second read. And I had more kind of mixed feelings in a good way, because I really had to reckon with that. Because it's
I love that about her writing. Sorry to like cut you off there.
No, I'm done. Yeah.
Like I felt, because nobody's got a superpower, and they're all riddled with both, like with this kind of like, it's not even clear that they necessarily want to rebel, like they're just existing and going through the motions and going and it having this inner dialogue of the complexity of what they're experiencing without getting to a place where they've made a decision on how to act. And that feels like, I don't know, it really resonated for me in my personal experience, but also it felt so different from any of the stories that I've read, or many of the stories that I've read. And I think, as you're saying, it feels like a much more accessible place to be, because we're not all the hero, and being the hero is so much work. But we spend, I don't know, I feel like I spend a lot of time in my head just thinking about what's going on around me and what people are experiencing. And so having these stories be about that reflection and operating also how your thoughts, kind of like the Sufism of the circle of like, I'm thinking about this, but I'm not getting to an answer, and I have to go to another place to kind of come at it from a different angle, because actually getting to it directly would be too much. It would be too much of a confrontation of my own weakness, or my powerlessness, or my fear of my power, that I'm not stepping into my power to act or to make a decision about where I stand. I was blown away by that part of her writing.
Yeah, it did make me think about how I feel like so much of being Black seems to be about like having to rebel, having to constantly be pushing back. And I don't know, rebellion is not a bad thing, obviously, but I think it just, again, I just appreciate how she adds dimension to how I think of myself in the world, and how I see it presented in literature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can't really tell you much about non-duality studies. It's like one of those, like, it's funny because I have a page marked in there and everything, but I don't know if it's anything I can, let me see, articulate. I know I was into it. Where is it again? But I also don't think I can sit
you know
here
what?
and be like, that's what it is about.
I want to talk about Honey Bear.
Honey Bear! Wow.
Honey Bear.
I read that story, I was like, what the fuck?
I was like, what are you doing to me? And can you do it again? Like, I love, you know, how do you tell an alien story without telling an alien story? How do you tell an invasion story without telling an invasion story? How dare you cross fairies and extraterrestrials?
And like vampires?
And fucking vampires. And give me like a beach and a leaking
nuclear incidents and shit. Like it was so weird.
I was like, what have you done? And thank you. Like, it was so it had such a creep element to it, because really the story is about a man and a woman and a child in a car going to the beach. On the surface, right? On the surface, that's what it is. There's a child, a man, a woman. They're going to the beach. They're going to a hotel, and then
he's a bit of a jerk.
They're going to go to the beach. Yeah, he's a bit grumpy. Mom maybe has a medical issue. Maybe she needs insulin. Maybe that's what it is. We don't know. Oh, and then the way that the dread. Okay, Claire, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
And the creep element, as you have like, why is he so mad that there's traffic? Wait, what?
And he has to make a detour, and then the slick, and I was like, oh, it's that oil spill or something. Like I thought a truck spilled over. That's what I thought. Like,
just calm down. You'll get there. And she's like, calm down. And Honey Bear's like, la, 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 right? And then, but the empty beach and the clown and like all of this stuff. It reminded me of, have you seen Us?
I have, yeah.
At the end, there's like this, when all of the people holding hands in red and whatever.
Yeah.
And there's that like, I guess it's sort of like an abandoned carnival near beach.
Yeah, theme park kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so theme parks, I love them and they freak me out. Like carnivals, love them, but also they freak me out.
Yeah.
And so that, the clown, the abandoned beach, and then these tall figures that are floating by. And I was just like, I love this. And I guess a trope that I find very interesting is like the sacrificial mother, the resilient mother who allows herself to be sacrificed or drained, and has to allow herself to be drained by a child, right? Like the ways that motherhood drain people, right? Drains people. And so I loved that. I loved how flat. Well, there was also like, there was this part in the story where the male in the couple, like his own kind of pulling out of his role, spending time with the neighbors, drinking,
having highballs and whatever.
Yeah, having highballs and just kind of being like, we don't need to do this. This was a mistake. But switching between like this genuine tenderness and like, I'm gonna do what I'm here to do. I'm gonna make sure
he was super competent at the end, like when the avoided and he was like boom boom boom, and I was like, oh you can do something. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're not whatless, like you're just so and that sense of like duty and your role and the protector. And so there was so much going on there. There's a lot unsaid about gender roles. Also, the idea of a child that is potentially more powerful than their parent, but yet is vulnerable and needs to be protected. And then the bargains, right? Like the bargains that humanity, and it's, I guess, for me, because I've been reading so much Octavia Butler, who very much is constantly talking about the bargains. Like, what are we going to give up? What will humanity have to give up? What has humanity given up in the past in order to maintain a sense of power, survival, dominance, whatever, right? And what do we say about that? And what decisions will we make? So I loved Honey Bear, and the title Honey Bear was just so sweet and terrifying.
It made me think of cereal at first. Like I was like, I think
Yeah.
maybe like, yeah, isn't there like some kind of, no, I think it's a bee mascot. Anyway, but it just very cute. And then I read it and I was like thoroughly creeped out at the end the first time. Second time was interesting for me because I came to it after reading quite a few disabled writers who in different ways wrote about that explicitly. So I couldn't help but look at it through a disability lens because the accommodations that had to be made just on a daily basis and the medications and the child like having a condition that doesn't act according to schedule, there's something that happens and you kind of like have to immediately respond, and the shortness that creates in persons in relationship with them, and the mother being the one who's sort of more responsive in a way reminded me of what disabled writers say, in the sense that those who are fellow disabled are usually better at giving them care, but at the same time are also sort of more vulnerable bodies, have their own you know, gaps in terms of being able to care. So it's like you are the more responsive and you're the one that understands, but then are probably also the most stressed and with the least resources out of like your community group. And so that really stood out to me. And then otherwise, sort of really appreciating the idea of futurity with reproduction that I thought this story addressed. This whole, you know, because it's always like the children are the future, and it's always like, it's happy and it's da 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 da. And this was, it was hopeful, but it was grim. And like the two coexisted side by side. So it's like the mother was like, no, this is life. And I'm actually the stronger one here for seeing it that way. But it wasn't like a honey bear, like kind of primrosy idea of life either. And how the person with the expectations of it sort of being that way thinks they're being a realist and thinks they're being the more practical one, but actually they kind of come off less prepared and maybe more naive about things because they can afford to be, you know, because he's not the one actually getting his blood sucked out. Like that was like, the writer is a parent herself, and I'm sort of really fascinated about how she writes about motherhood in these stories, because they come up in these very sort of twisty kind of mixed very
like, so let's just look at how to get back to the forest and parenthood and how
it was so weird. What did you think about that? Because that's what I'm still
well, it really, like, there was such a cult element to it, and then, you know, this institution, like I loved that story. I loved how we saw indoctrination through the lens of an indoctrinated teenager. And we saw how others, children and teens, were used to promulgate these very violent beliefs and this this sort of genocidal exercise, like slow genocidal exercise. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read Gutter Child. It's a debut novel. I forget the name of the person, but it's
I'm looking it up right now. So
it's her debut YA novel, and saying like children institution.
Gail Richardson, is that it?
Gail Richardson. Very, very, very interesting, right? Taking a child away from their parents, taking a child away from their community, and
very colonial.
It's super colonial, but giving them the parental figures, I thought was really interesting because, again, another play on the words, right? Like we use terms like a mother figure, you know, every child needs a father figure. Every child needs a mother figure. Everybody needs that. And so I love how Samatar takes these phrases, catchphrases that we use, and then makes them literal and turns them, like objectifies them, so that we get to examine them as physical objects, right? So so C, whose name is C, and she's the only one who sees what's going on. So C's mother figure is a notebook, which was very, for me, as somebody who journals, and, you know, as somebody who cares about, you know, legacy and stuff like that, I thought it was very powerful that her mother figure would be a notebook. Whereas, like, and then also, you know, the curiosity of the main character's parental figure to be a lamp, and that needs to be plugged in, and, like, you know, only at the end of the story does you know, the light switch turn on for her. And, you know, even though she had illumination at all times, and I just love how we got to explore that. But if you take the two stories together, you have one story that talks about the sacrifice of parenting in this world, and the heartbreak of being childless, and the sacrifices of having a child in order to keep yourself protected in this world. And then you have this other story that takes the parents away at earlier and earlier ages. So they go from generation teen to generation 8, take them away from their parents at age 8. And then you have these people who are just like choosing not to have children because they can't bear the heartbreak of the separation. And I remember meeting a woman who said, parenting is the slowest heartbreak I've ever experienced, right? Like, you give birth to them, and then year by year, they walk away from you. It's the longest walking away I've ever experienced in my life. And she's like, you know, the minute you give birth, you're never as close to this child. And it's a constant distancing. She's like, this is the most heartbreaking relationship I've ever had in my life. You know, and you know, she's like, my son was inside of me. That is as close as anyone has ever been and will ever be. And now he's gone, you know? And so I just feel like how Samatar takes us into the relationship between parents, adoptive parents, birth parents, surrogate parents, parents that are immobile objects, and gets us to look at that. I don't remember the name of the story, but it's the one where Sasha's writing to Mr. Fox.
That's the last one, the red thread.
The red thread. So first of all, I mean, I need to read that again, because I was wondering if there's a connection between the story, the red thread, and the red thread that shows up in Ogres of East Africa.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
And then so in terms of the red thread, so I guess I was thinking about it first on your point about disability, and how it seems like the mother of Sarah, or the companion of Sarah, is in a wheelchair, I think.
Yeah, the wheelchair user.
Yeah, so she's a wheelchair user. And so that really got me thinking about, like, survival and, you know, apocalypse. And I always have this in my mind, you know, if we were in the midst of rebellion, you know, who would be at the front of the running horde, and who would be at the back, and how do you manage that, right? Like, how do you make sure that everyone is safe?
Because even in marches now, they don't necessarily, depending on who's planning, think about how to include disabled people now. And that's just a regular, you know, protest march, much less a survival. Right. Yeah.
And so the best that I've seen is, like, designated spaces for designated accessible spaces
Mhm.
but those are usually static spaces,
Mm.
as opposed to spaces where they're safe and people will be able to move along with a crowd. So I like wondered about that, right? And so will temporarily able-bodied individuals stop, slow down, go back and protect those who can't keep up, who move slower, who need devices or medication or care?
Mhm.
Like what will we do? We have many options, but what will we actually do?
Yeah.
And so, I think about that a lot. But in addition to that, in the red thread, we also have like a mother and daughter relationship here, like in many of the stories,
Yeah.
from again a different angle. Like what happens when you have to obey your mother, but you also disagree with her choices around survival. And
And you
I'm
can
just like,
daydream. It's very daylight come, actually.
it is very daylight come.
Yeah.
And yeah, it certainly is that. And then also, I don't know if you've read Butler's Parable of the Sower and
And
Parable.
I've read the horoscope books. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, there you've got an absent mother, but also I love mother-daughter stories and mother-children stories. I love that. The
Mhm.
the mother-daughter relationship is explored in the Broken Earth trilogy
Sure.
by N.K. Jemisin. It's explored in many of the books that I've read, because I think I certainly have like a complicated and loving relationship with my own mother,
Mhm.
that's gone through stress and strain, and I think most Black queer folks have, right?
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. I know that we are sort of closing in on the time that we usually end.
Okay.
What would you what did you want to make sure we covered?
I didn't really have, I just wanted it to be a free flowing convo because at first I was coming with, oh, I need to come up with book club questions, and then realized that my brain wasn't really working with that. So I was like, I know that I had things that resonated with me. I'll just come and we'll just have conversation flow.
Okay.
So I think, so there's like, yeah, there's nothing major outside of, I think what we all got, which is that she's really, I think, a unique writing talent within this space. And I think a lot more people should read her so that I can talk about it with you guys. Like, hello. I just think it would spark a lot more interesting conversations because I think she kind of complements current writing trends, or at least what's made more visible in really interesting and intriguing ways. Especially when it comes to writing Africa into diaspora works. And so that's it for me. I just want folks to read Sofia Samatar. And I kind of feel like this short stories collection is the most sort of accessible way because you can kind of pick and go through and find stories that you
Yeah.
mentioned. And it's a small publisher. We love small publishers, Small Bear Press. Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you for this, because I have A Stranger in Alondria. I don't have Winged Histories yet.
Yeah. And Monster Portraits, which is also really weird as well. It's memoir writing, but it's like Ogres of East Africa, but memoir kind of. So you just know that's going to be super weird, and it has her brother's art in it. And it's really short. Like all of her books are just really unique and beautiful and weird. And I want more beautiful, unique, and weird Black writing out there in the world for people to take part in. Yeah.
Thank you. We should talk about, you've given me an idea about like weird books.
Ooh, yeah.
Because like weird books, there's a book behind you.
Sure. Which one?
On the other side.
This
and
side?
No, the other side.
This side.
Yeah, that one. Like it's red red and purple, like on the spine.
Oh, She Called Me Woman. Is it this one?
Yeah, I think. Can I see the?
This is a fantastic.
I think I got that. I think.
Yeah, I thought you had mentioned it.
I think Noria got me that as a gift. Yes.
Ah, yeah. Oh, that's so funny because it was a Nigerian friend who got me my copy too. Nigerians are the best. Yes, have you read it yet?
No, have you?
I love, girl. I love this book. So it's She Calls Me Woman. And there are cis and trans women in here, and then also persons who don't necessarily identify with any one particular gender. But the range of experiences here, oh my God, made me feel so enveloped in queer community with all our joys and horrors and sorrows and flaws, and in ways that sort of made me sigh, but made me love us more. And I have to say, as a Jamaican who went to boarding school, reading the Nigerian boarding school experience, all girls school boarding school experiences was revelatory in the way we were the same but different. And I think it really pushed me to expand my idea of what life is like in so-called homophobic spaces, because these girls at these Nigerian boarding schools were way braver than us in Jamaica, like way braver. It was, oh my God, it's such an astonishing, beautiful book. And it's from Cassava Republic Press, which is a Nigerian publisher. And I highly, highly, highly recommend it.
I think, thank you for that. I think I want to do like a series on ONYX Pages where like people who I admire like you, that I'm like, we just do this. Like, it's just like, show me your shelf.
Show me your shelf. Oh, yeah.
You know, like what's on your shelf that's like weird, that's fun, that's cool, that you want more people to read and that kind of stuff, right? Like I'm even seeing Sylvia Moreno Garcia's
from DCL. Yeah, Gods of Jade and Shadow. I think all of these were books that were decentered lit books. So yeah, along there.
So, anyway, we're gonna go offline. Stay on. We're gonna go offline now. For people who are watching our or who have watched our conversation of Tender by Sofia Samatar. SOULar Powered is it's a Black speculative fiction book club based on Facebook. It's been around since 2014. And Kiki from If This Is Paradise on Instagram. Are you also on Book Talk?
Not really, not yet, but
Okay,
I think I'm gonna. Yeah, so it's just Instagram for now until I get my TikTok presence in gear, because Instagram is the pits.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. And if you have read Tender or any of Sofia Samatar's work and you'd like to talk about it, feel free to leave a comment here. Feel free to also chat please find Kiki.
Find Kiki
on Insta and talk to her about Sofia Samatar's work.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye. Okay, I'm gonna just